Good morning. My name is Barry Anderson. I'm an Associate Justice on the Minnesota Supreme Court. I'm delighted to be here. I have a little experience with this program, not only as a judge, but there was a time, a long time ago, when I was on your side of the table, at least coaching students in this competition. So I understand some of the stress you're under, and we'll try not to aggravate that. Professor Chambers.
Hello, I'm Hank Chambers. I'm a law professor at the University of Richmond. I've been at this for way too long. No. I've been at just long enough, but before you all were born. So it's really good to see you all, and I look forward to the conversation this morning.
Ms. Zimkin?
Hi, I'm Ann Zinkin. I'm a career law clerk at the New Hampshire Supreme Court. Been here for about 21 years. And prior to that, I was a litigator in San Francisco. Been doing We the People for somewhere between 5 and 10 years, and I have no clue when I started. And I'm very excited to be here.
You'd be so kind as to introduce your team and your coaching and staff.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is good morning. My name is Julian Wang.
I'm Jared Leonard.
I'm Matthew Genzer, joined by our teacher, Ms. Kammerman from Staples High School.
Very good. We're here to discuss Unit 4, the values and principles embodied in the Constitution and how they shaped American institutions and practices. And the question that we're going to be discussing this morning is question 1. It would be inconsistent with the constitutional separation of the executive and legislative powers to let the prerogative or pardon power be exercised by the latter. What were the framers' reasons for giving the president the pardon power, and do you agree or disagree with those reasons? According to the framer James Wilson, if the president abuses the pardon power, he can be impeached and prosecuted. Do you agree with Wilson? Why or why not? Finally, in your opinion, what constitutes high crimes and misdemeanors? If the panel is ready to proceed, we are looking forward to having a conversation this morning. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. The power of the executive pardon existed long before the Constitution, being derived from the English king's prerogative to pardon convicts, as well as the power of most colonial governors to do the same.
Many framers feared that the presidential pardon power would be abused, much like King George's sovereign powers were. George Mason argued that the president shouldn't have the power to pardon because he may frequently pardon crimes which were advised by himself. Some advocated for total legislative control over the pardon power because the alternative would, as said in Anti-Federalist 67, trend towards the establishment of a vile and arbitrary aristocracy or monarchy.
However, many disagreed with legislative pardons. According to Rufus King, legislators are governed too much by the passions of the moment and too fickle in their decisions. Roger Sherman proposed that instead, executive pardons require consent of the Senate, but this was quickly disregarded in favor of a unilateral executive pardon.
Supporting this, Randolph warned of a great danger to liberty if Congress was allowed to intrude into a traditionally executive power. Supporters like James Wilson claimed that this president was already checked by the legislature to prevent abuses of pardons through impeachment. This was a sensible rationale at the time, considering the history of impeachment.
Legal scholar Cass R. Sunstein writes that impeachment was a movement in the direction of replacing monarchical absolutism with something closer to parliamentary democracy. This required the king's ministers, who were beyond the reach of criminal courts, to be removed from office. So the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors came to represent serious offenses not in direct violation of conventional law.
During the impeachment trial of Richard Nixon, the House Judiciary Committee issued a study on the legal meaning of high crimes and misdemeanors. It found that the phrase extends beyond crimes to include behaving in a manner grossly incompatible with the proper function of the office and employing the power of the office for an improper purpose or personal gain. Thus, abusing the pardon power to protect oneself and one's accomplices does warrant impeachment.
However, today's political climate and hyper-partisanship in Congress has weakened impeachment as a check on the pardon power. Presidential historian Russell Riley criticized President Trump's wave of pardons that went unchecked at the end of his presidency, saying nobody with a straight face can argue that this use of the pardon power is consistent with what the framers envisioned when they conveyed it in Article 2. President Trump was certainly not the first president to questionably use the pardon power, but he was the most recent president to do so, and he was not hesitant to pardon Roger Stone or Paul Manafort because the Republican Senate would have never convicted him had he been impeached.
Hamilton was fearful of partisanship undermining the impeachment process in Federalist 65. He stated that with impeachment, there will always be the greatest danger that the decision will be regulated more by the comparative strength of parties than by the real demonstrations of innocence or guilt. Knowing this, the framers thought giving the power to convict to the Senate would make impeachment less beholden to politics. But after the 17th Amendment required the direct election of senators, this check became insufficient.
Congress must expand its executive checks in the form of legislation in response to greater potential for pardon abuse. The Protecting Our Democracy Act would require presidents to explain pardons and formally prohibit bribery for pardons and self-pardons. More significantly, the Abuse of Pardon Prevention Act, introduced by Representative Adam Schiff, would check the deploying of pardons in cases involving the president or his family by forcing any evidence gathered in such an investigation be provided to Congress.
Abuses of pardons are not the only transgressions that constitute a high crime and misdemeanor. President Trump employed presidential power for personal gain when he leveraged U.S. military aid to Ukraine to force them to launch an investigation into then presidential candidate Joe Biden. Likewise, Trump egregiously broke his oath of office when he propagated baseless claims of voter fraud and then incited an insurrection to stop the confirmation of the 2020 election. The Senate should have convicted Trump for both of these high crimes.
The value of impeachment is akin to the sword of Damocles. As it is said, the value of the sword is not that it falls, but rather that it hangs. The sword of impeachment should hang over those who are tempted to abuse the power of the office, and if they do, it must fall for the sake of the legitimacy and integrity of America's democracy. Thank you, and we are now ready for questioning.
So you make a powerful argument that the presidential pardon power has been abused in the past, and there need to be checks on the presidential pardon power. I want to push back on that a little bit and raise the possibility that by doing so, we may limit the ability of controversial pardons that are later found to be, or later seen historically to be correct or at least useful. And I would point to the pardon by Gerald Ford of Richard Nixon, highly criticized, probably cost Ford his election, but none other than Senator Kennedy later said, you know, I was wrong, Ford was right, the pardon made sense. There are other historical examples. Do we give that up if we adopt your suggestions that we need to restrict the presidential pardon power?
So we do not give that up if we push back on controversial use of the pardon power. You can look at the President Carter's pardon of Peter Yarrow, the famed folk singer, who was rightfully convicted of sexual misconduct with a 14-year-old. I think the stakes of someone saying that pardon is better in the future and that should have been done is much lower and less, and the democracy is safer if we are strict on limiting abuses of pardon.
Additionally, when President Clinton had pardoned his half-brother Roger Clinton, it was not a case to remedy the wrongdoings of the judicial process, but yet after he pardoned his brother for after serving a year in prison for pleading guilty to cocaine distribution charges, this was a clear use of nepotism, not in a way to overcome the faults of the judicial process.
And in the end, the harms of a president abusing the pardon power simply outweigh the benefit that a president could possibly be right. Because as we see, the framers meant for impeachment to be an effective check on the president. And when we don't have that, it opens up the ways for all sorts of pardon abuses, even if there is an occasional case where it's used in a correct manner.
Professor Chambers.
So should the president have to justify a pardon, or should the president just be able to give a pardon?
So we specifically support President Obama's dealing with pardons. He did it in a manner that was independent and in tandem with the Department of Justice that went through a series of checks and ultimately issued several pardons on extreme prosecutions of drug crimes.
In our response, we also quote the Protecting Our Democracy Act, which was introduced in the House, where the president would have to legally be obliged to explain pardons. And while the Constitution does say that pardons themselves should be absolute, it also gives Congress the ability to legislate when a pardon might be given, like the circumstances in which it may be given. One of them could be including explaining a pardon.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
It's also important to note that President Obama's use of the pardon power in aiding his administration's rethinking of the harsh mandatory minimum drug sentences of the 1980s was a more direct application of the pardon power that the framers had envisioned when they created the pardon power and granted it to the presidency.
So did President Obama do anything other than say, I don't like the law, so I'm going to not apply it?
Well, he had used his pardon power to aid his push for criminal justice reform, which had been rethinking the drug charges mandates in the 1980s. And it was a more effective use of the pardon power in the sense that the pardon power should not be doled out to the president's political allies and associates, as we have seen in many other instances, but rather to remedy the overlooked cases that often go unchecked in the judicial process.
Okay.
So you make a good argument that impeachment hasn't acted as a limit, as intended, on the pardon power. And I'm wondering why you think that is. Why hasn't the hang of impeachment limited the use of the pardon power?
So we think that impeachment has not been the effective check on presidential pardons because it's just you have to overcome extreme partisan obstacles to have a sufficient conviction, because it has to go through both chambers of Congress, which is the main obstacle.
In addition to that, impeachment is just such a big deal that if a pardon is suspect, or if it's like sort of abusive but not necessarily a high crimes and misdemeanor, the Congress doesn't really have a recourse beyond taking the major step of impeaching the president, which might not even be politically viable for the ruling party in Congress.
And additionally, as we saw in Bill Clinton's impeachments, as well as President Trump's, most members of Congress voted on party lines. And in doing so, it nullifies the ability of the impeachment process to actually act as a viable solution to abuses of power when members of Congress choose to put their parties over the real substance and facts of impeachment processes.
So everything you mentioned, though, was in process in the early 1800s. Did the framers just get it wrong?
Sorry, did the framers just get the check of impeachment wrong?
Yeah, they structured it exactly how it's working now. Did they just get it wrong in terms of how to structure impeachment?
So in Federalist 65, Alexander Hamilton expressed his fear that impeachment would inherently be a political process and be decided by a self-interest of political parties. And he thought that because the Senate was originally composed of senators who were selected by state legislatures, it would be independent enough to not be swayed by political factions. However, because of the 17th Amendment, which the framers did not foresee, so technically they did not get it wrong. However, it has developed to be a weakened check.
And additionally, I don't think the framers couldn't have anticipated such a hyper-partisan atmosphere that we find ourselves today in today's political climate. And in doing so, they had no way in preventing such abuses and the nullification of the impeachment process.
Okay.
Do you think that the framers intended to allow president to pardon himself or herself? And if so, why or why not?
So the framers, there's no discussion about the framers' opinion on self-pardons, but during the impeachment trial, Richard Nixon, the acting assistant attorney general, Mary Lyon, in the famous April 5th, 1974 memorandum opinion, said that under the fundamental rule that no one can be a judge in his own case, the president cannot issue a self-pardon. So he would be deciding his own innocence. So then that would be an abuse of the pardon power. Other scholars look to Article 2, in which the president must vow to faithfully execute the laws. So it would be in bad faith to execute a self-pardon because it would not be executing the office of the presidency correctly.
Thank you very much. Your time has expired. Very much enjoyed your presentation this morning. I just want to make a couple of comments. You know, we often say at the start of these things that it's not so much how you answer the question, but do you demonstrate your command of the material? And I think that that was illustrated by my question to you. There's a reasonable argument about why or whether or not, in the example I cited, Ford should have pardoned Nixon. And I think your response in defending your position was pretty good. That you know, the sort of individual nature of some of these abuses of power really does need to be controlled. There's some interesting constitutional issues about whether or not Representative Schiff and his act are you know, going to ultimately prove to carry the day. But you know, that's a separate question. I thought your response was quite good. And you know, there is this debate about it. I thought your point about the 17th Amendment, you know, changing the character of the Senate and maybe altering a little bit what the founders intended. They didn't see the 17th Amendment coming. You know, I thought that was a good point. So I thought it was a strong presentation, and I enjoyed participating in the conversation this morning. Professor Chambers.
Absolutely. I think it was very, very strong. Here's where you will see some disagreement sometimes among judges. I think the 17th Amendment point is legit. The problem is, of course, the 17th Amendment had not been passed when Andrew Johnson's impeachment occurred, and that was arguably the most controversial one out there. But the point that you made, the general point, I think is a good one, right? So I think on that score, absolutely right. I think y'all did a really nice job of trying to think your way through the Obama marijuana pardons. I think you did a very strong job, the strongest job you could, considering, even though I'm for those particular pardons, it was pure policy, right? It really was. It really had nothing to do with, well, it was policy, and I like the policy, so I like the pardons, right? So really good stuff there. This is tough stuff, and I think y'all handled it really nicely. So very happy with the conversation this morning. Y'all did a great job.
I echo what my fellow judges have said. I was really impressed with your depth of knowledge, your command of the material, the fact that you were able to talk about historical examples and modern examples and sort of weave them seamlessly. And one of the things I so appreciate about this program is I learned something. So it hadn't occurred to me that the change in how the senators were elected weakened the ability of impeachment to act as a limit on the pardon power. And I really appreciated you all making that point. So thank you for teaching me something I didn't know.
So congratulations.